Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. The conference has started on a very fast pace, and I'll try to catch up. I felt quite pressured by the pace of how it's going. My presentation today, which I believe will be put on very soon, is about two practices that existed from 1988 to 1996 and an exhibition that took place in 2015, which was an investigation of these two practices and a reconstruction of the crime scene, to refer to the metaphor of the title of my talk. I'm just wondering if my PPT is being put on. But I will continue while it's being put up. So to backtrack a little bit, these two practices existed, as I said, from 1988 to 1996. There were two prime examples of early conceptual art practices in China. But even though it happened only 2 decades ago, a very short span of time, there is very little documentation about these two practices. But more importantly, most of the artists that were involved in the two practices had ceased practicing art. And they had also ceased interacting with the art world. So they withdrew themselves almost completely from the art world. They no longer talk about their practice, they no longer make art. And their absence makes it even harder for later generation of art critics and artists to understand their work. Also, one of the challenges and attractions to recovering their practices was that their works were destroyed by the artists when they were making the works. In the case of the artist in Shanghai called Qian Weikang, he made most of his works in the 1990s. It's very hard to talk without the images.
Just a second,
yeah.
We have a small error.
Okay, sure. But he destroyed all the installations that he made simply due to the fact that he did not have a place to store them. And they were all temporarily made site-specifically for a certain exhibition site. And in the other case, a New Measurement Group, which was an artist collective consisting of 3 members that was based in Beijing, in 1996, when they decided to stop practicing, they disbanded the collective. They also destroyed all the manuscripts and all the evidences of that practice that existed in their hands. In both cases, there was also embedded a resistance to a marketization of their work, to attempts to commercializing their practices. And this exhibition that I would be talking about was made in 2015, and this was an exhibition that I made in collaboration with artist Liu Ding to revisit their practices and to reconstruct their works without the participation of the artists. The artists were all informed and aware of our efforts to reconstruct their works, but they made a conscious decision not to be involved, simply because they have stopped considering and practicing artwork as their practice. And this exhibition was also part of an ongoing historical research that I have been working on with Liu Ding. This historical research is entitled The Legacy of Social Realism in the Historical Narrative and Practice of Contemporary in China. This is a research that we have been working on for the past 5 years. And the main motivation or the kind of starting point for this research was growing dissatisfaction on our part about the existing historical narrative of contemporary in China. And I'll read out some of the notes I wrote here about this research. As I said, the motivation for this research was that we found existing accounts of the history of contemporary in China, especially the commonly accepted ones, based on the perspective of its rupture from the revolutionary eras and its confrontational relationship with the state, an oversimplified and limiting story. In practice, it fails to provide sufficient and nuanced explanations for complexities of the actual historical situations. Meanwhile, it has seemed to lose its momentum in terms of providing stimulus for current practices and thoughts. Our research sets out to reassess the historical narrative and discursive construct of contemporary in China. Our reassessment is carried out through considering the continuous presence of the legacy of socialist realism in the practice and discourse of contemporary Chinese art. This research analyzes how the ideas and mechanisms of socialist realism were circulated, internalized, and institutionalized as a principal guideline for practice and the evaluation of practice, after it ceased being a predominant art form in 1976. We ask, what is the historical process of the construction of contemporary art and its identities, both by cultural officials, individual practitioners, and historians, from the late 20th century to the early 21st century, focusing on its relationship towards and interactions with their state's ideological and institutional frameworks. So we situate the practices, the historical practices from the 1940s to the current practices in the institutional and ideological framework of the nation, of the country. In this research and exhibition series, we approach historical periods and practices with what we call revisits and thick descriptions, terms and methods of an archaeological nature, meaning that we do not offer evaluation or rush to form a new historical narrative about these practices, but to bring them out and to sketch out these practices in great detail in order to develop a deeper understanding of them or to open up new possibilities of reading them instead of continuing understanding them in existing frameworks. Now that we have the PPT here, I can show you some images of the exhibition in which we reconstructed these two parallel conceptual art practices with very little supports of documentations or the artist's actual involvement in the reconstruction of their works. And I will also talk a little bit about the complexities and complications of reconstructions, which we try also to visualize and articulate these challenges in the exhibition itself. On the upper hand, the three artists, the three images here are portraits of the three artists that were involved in New Measurement Group. This was the artist group that was based in Beijing. Underneath is a portrait of the artist Qian Weikang. He was based in Shanghai. Coincidentally, these two practices existed in the same period, in the late 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, and they ceased practice in 1996 simultaneously. This was a coincidence. But what we found out and what drove us to present these two practices together was we found that there were a lot of parallel concerns in their work and in their thinking about their practice. So first, I will be showing the Basically, the exhibition consists of two parallel exhibitions, and one was an exhibition of Qian Weikang, and the other was an exhibition of New Measurement Group. And I'll show you the exhibition of Qian Weikang to begin with. This was a floor plan of the exhibition. This was the beginning of the exhibition of Qian Weikang. It was an early work of his, which he actually did not really consider an integral part of his own visual art practice. He did not train, he did not receive any formal training as an artist. He was working in a factory as a worker. And during the 1980s, while working in the factory, he practiced, he was very much influenced by the modern literature movement at that time and the introduction of foreign literature movements, including zero-degree literature movement, zero-degree writing literature movement in the 1980s. And in his spare time, he started to explore this way of writing poetry, which involved him looking through a dictionary at that time, randomly picked out characters and wrote them on papers. And he also drew the chalk lines on the floor of his living quarter at that time. And he would climb up a ladder and he sprayed the characters onto the floor, and that will form the poems. He basically wrote the poems following the movements of the characters on the floor. This was a work that has no documentation. He never took any photographs. We read about it in an interview that he gave with Shanghai-based curator Biliana Sirik. And we asked him again about it. And in our exhibition, we reenacted the movements based on his description, and we created the poems here. This was a very important beginning to the exhibition, as if we tried to get into the position of the artist. It was also a very symbolic gesture that we wanted to present the very beginning of an artist's thinking and practice, even though he himself did not really consider it a work of his. And the show continues with us presenting all 12 installations he made during his career. Many of his works were based on the idea of measurement, the idea of translating human experiences into data, into tangible, rational data. So in this work, for example, he recorded the quantity of the amount of liquid and food that he consumed in one day, and also the quantity of his pee, his things that he let out from his body, in a way translating a day of human experiences into a set of data. We presented also a very important and poetic work of his in the exhibition, again, only based on these 3 photographs. This was a work that he made towards the end of his career. And it was in the library in Shanghai where he made curtains to the windows of the library. But instead of fixing the curtains as we usually do, he fixed 4 handheld scales to the 4 corners of the window so that it measures the wind, measures the movements of the wind. So as you can see, we recreated the work throughout the exhibition as a very poetic gesture of recalling and evoking the poetic nature in his practice. We also recreated a very early work of his in 1993, where he, this was a floor plan of an exhibition in a gallery, underground gallery space in Shanghai, in the art school. in order to have access to gallery, he found himself a job as a guard to the gallery. And while working in the gallery, he began to stage a series of exhibitions where he and his colleagues, his fellow artists, could make exhibitions. And most of his works were made in this gallery in Shanghai. So in the exhibition, we actually we recreated the height of the gallery throughout the exhibition space by indicating a line of the height of the gallery, since most of his installations were made in this gallery. I have 2 minutes left, right? So I'm going to rush through the images so that you can have a sense of the works. So also very much, as you can see here, the idea of how we recreated the exhibition and the works was very much like a manual, an instruction book, where we presented the work that we recreated, but we also presented the instructions as how the work was recreated, the data, the very dry but very technical detail of the recreation of the work. And similarly, I just go quickly to the other exhibition about new measurement group. This was the new measurement group. And throughout their practice, they already created 5 books, and the 5 books existed in 5 foreign languages other than Chinese, because they were commissioned for exhibitions that took place outside of China. Their works were mainly based on instructions, and in fact, actually, none of the artists involved remember clearly how the works work, how the actual instructions were recreated. So in order to recreate that practice, we actually put together a 3-member team to imitate their way of working and to work their process of analysis data backward to reach to find out how they recreated how they created the instructions. So this was the side of the exhibition. Again, the exhibition was very much like an instruction book to review and to indicate how the works were made and how it was positioned in the practice of the artist. To conclude, what I want to talk about in this presentation is that we were very much aware that as curators, we are approaching the works of artists from a current position. So in the exhibition, we consciously articulated this gap between our recreation and the original state of the work, and to acknowledge this absence of the artist's involvement, and also to open up the discussion in terms of the meaning and the challenges of recreating them today. Thank you.